Hello everyone and welcome to another action-packed, exciting edition of the Magic Sandwich Show. On the panel this week we have Concordance, we have Mr. Aaron Ra, and we have Almighty Athismo back for the third show in a row, again by popular request. The fourth person whose image you may see on the screen is Tony Slutface. He is the person that's doing the organisation behind the scenes, so thank you very much to Tony for doing that. The main theme for today's programme is the question of whether to accommodate or confront religion and what the best tactic to use is. And we'll of course be taking calls. If you want to appear on the show, please send a contact request to Magicsandwichshow on Skype. Before we get on to that issue though, this week Aaron Ra appeared before the Texas Board of Education, so we're going to start with an account of that experience. Aaron. You need to unmute your microphone, Aaron. Working with amateurs. We can't hear you at all at the moment. Aaron, whilst you're fixing your microphone problems, if I can just explain, on Blog TV what you should be able to see above the video box is there's a new banner which is advertising the MSF Doctors Without Borders event, which will be taking place on the 17th to 18th of September of this year. It has active links on it, so you can go, for example, to any of the donation pages. You can go to the schedule. We can also, I think we've got links to the Facebook account that we have, and also a Twitter account. So if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in relation to that, that's the best way of doing it. I will be telling you a funny story about Eugenie Scott, but I think Aaron now has volume. Aaron, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you notice when you have these conversations with the creationists, they try to play semantic word games to try to get out of something. And in this case, one of the members of the Board of Education wanted to play a word game that yes or no is a factual error to say that that the phylogenies, that the morphological phylogenies always match.
Oh, and before you get into too much detail, could you just give a little bit of background to put it into context? What was the nature of the meeting?
All right, well, once again, we got this advertisement and it was passed around Facebook saying that the Board of Education was once again going to be debating evolution and whether they were going to be putting evolution into their textbooks. Since they have wiped out the Texas economy and can no longer afford actual textbooks, they were voting on supplementals that were online ebooks, 10 of which, according to the advertisement, were being produced by the Discovery Institute and another organization in New Mexico that was also pushing creationism. At least this was according to the advertisements. So I followed advice to go down to Austin to present my case along with about 50 other people. I was proud to say that there were maybe 10 creationists there, and when I say 10, I mean that there weren't actually 10, there were fewer than that, but they were representing multiple people each, because the creationists didn't come down to speak for themselves. They sent someone to go speak for them. So you have one guy going up and reading the testimonies of 2 or 3 different people. And they're basically pulling citations out of Jonathan Wells' Icons of Evolution. That's literally what they were doing. And using all the oldest arguments you've ever heard. And unfortunately, some of the scientists were doing this too, because professional scientists usually don't have time to be playing around on YouTube doing these kinds of discussions that we have. And that's why I felt actually valuable being in the room. And it was fortuitous, the timing, because while everyone else was pleading for, to provide the best education for our children, it was falling on deaf ears, because you're talking to a board that is largely creationist, and they feel that the best education for our children is to indoctrinate them. And they don't think that it is indoctrination. They think that actual science education is indoctrination, so they've got it completely backwards. And whenever they think that they can use some logical fallacy to deny evolution, that they consider critical thinking. That's their category for critical thinking, the denial of accepted science. When you are critical of accepted science, then you can confidently claim that you're a critical thinker, and it's completely backwards. So we had this one guy, Ken Mercer, who asked all these people representing science that came before him whether it was a factual statement that the molecular phylogenies always match the morphological phylogenies. And what he had stated, and I didn't hear him when I was in the room with him, I couldn't make out what he was saying about this, but he was trying to propose that you have one tree of life that's based on morphology and that supports Darwin, and that you have another tree of life that doesn't support Darwin, and this is the one that's based on molecular phylogenies. I didn't understand that the depth of his misunderstanding, or that how intentional it was. I was the fifth person to explain to him the reality of the situation, paraphrased. And when I did go back and rewatch these things to put my own compilation video together about it, I realized what it was that he was trying to say. And I realized then that I wished that I'd known that when I was speaking to him, because I would have been able to say, when he said that it is a factual error that the morphology always matches the genetic phylogenies, I would have said that it would be equally accurate to say that they always match at greater than 80% identical, even in the most deviant cases. That most of the time they match without any deviation at all. Most of the time they're relatively perfect, but there are corrections, and they are all one tree. I did tell him this much, that it was all one tree. It wasn't one tree that supports Darwin and one tree that doesn't. They're the same tree. And I guess I should have just gone into more depth with that, and talking about how you do a genetic test to determine who is somebody's father. That sort of thing. It's not like the kid didn't have a father. We know that. And you might be mistaken when you try to go on the traits of a child, who their parents are. But and then you use the genetic confirmation of who their parents are. And I did tell him that the way that he was phrasing the question was dishonest, because it led to a misperception. And of course he ignored that completely. He had previously been told that he was spending too much time working on controversies, and he rejected everything that was told to him. But as long as he could claim that one point was a statistical error, that he might be able to get it out of the textbooks.
From my understanding, and having watched the video that you posted, that was the only point that he had.
We also argued quite a bit about Hegel. He did not question me about embryos, but he did give me a chance to bring up my 5-part series on falsifying phylogeny, and I do intend to send links to 2 of those videos at least, one of which discusses Haeckel's embryos. Because one of the guys that was in this Board of Education meeting, the first one that shows up in my video, nobody has commented on this that I've seen so far, he said, as most of the people on the board did, that Haeckel's embryos were fraudulent. Now, while a drawing, in any classification, a drawing is not going to be as accurate as a photograph, to say that his drawings were fraudulent is pushing it. But also, when they take the pictures out, when they take the original drawings out and replace them with photographs, that witness, if you'll pay attention, he says that even when they replace Haeckel's drawings with micro photographs, that is still fraudulent. Why? Because it presents the same story. Why? Because it is still evidence of the same reality. But they don't accept that reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's really somewhat sad that their criticisms of science seem to be restricted to very small areas. You've mentioned one. We've also got Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man. And you just hear these being brought out time and time again. They've all been dealt with, and I just don't understand. Well, I do understand. They haven't got anything else to attack us with.
I just wanted to say that this reminds me a lot of the junk DNA argument. We've discovered some exceptions to the rule that, a large percentage of the genome is non-coding. It has a structural role, and we've known that for a long time. But you present it to a lay audience, and they don't get the differences, right? What sounds like a very controversial kind of finding, scientists baffled by X, Y, or Z, isn't really any kind of radical revolution. It's just bad reporting. It's the kind of the way that the journalists want to present something interesting and controversial about the research, when in fact they've discovered, some minor element, some 2 or 3% of the genome has some secondary role that we're just discovering, or something that was proposed, tested, and just verified from evolutionary science. Evolution suggests that a certain percentage of conserved sequences will have a structural or a regulatory role rather than a coding role, but you get someone smart on the stand in front of a jury, and they will not be able to sort of dispel this myth that scientists once thought that all of the genome except for the genes was unimportant. That's never been the case. And none of the creationists have added any additional information about molecular biology to the argument, but they can certainly exploit these little cracks where there's a disconnect between what scientists understand and what the public at large understands. And so you get a lot of Google scholars, and they look over the evidence and they say, aha, here's the smoking gun that evolution isn't real. This one tiny thing can be falsified about evolution. And that's not the case. It's a lack of knowledge and a lack of public understanding. It's just very hard to combat.
That was exactly this guy's argument. He was saying that if it doesn't always match, that it must not match entirely. It doesn't, and when we said it doesn't always match 100%, he's of course not getting that. He's suggesting that if it doesn't always match, it means that there's sometimes you get something that is 100% not a match. Because remember, he has one tree that he imagines supports Darwin and another tree that doesn't, meaning that he's arguing against a common ancestor. So he's implying that there are phylogenetics trees that do not support a common ancestor and the same common ancestry that the morphological trees all point to. Now, we may have a difference in, whether the pangolins belong to the anteaters or whether they belong to the condylars, but we know they're eutherian mammals and that the entire train of sequential common ancestors past them are all the same, whether we're talking about the morphology or the genetics. But he wants to find that one pigeonhole that he can come up with some bullshit to say that there's something that doesn't match. This is the one tree that supports Darwin and the other tree that doesn't. And he says, don't you think we should teach children about those trees? Yes. I think children should be taught about those other trees that support Darwin and this other tree as well. Willful ignorance has always stupefied me. I don't understand how people can try to latch onto these things to make themselves believe or to force an illusion that on some level they have to know is inaccurate, because if it requires the word games that they play, it must be inaccurate.
We've got a common theme, right, which is there's a difference between the one thing that science really has as an advantage over creationism in general and science denialism in general is that the denialists start with their conclusion and work their way backwards. So someone that's looking for some exception to Darwin finds it, gets very excited, and then puts all this meaning into it. Somehow this one small element disproves the giant pile of evidence in support, when in fact it's just an interesting exception. And the biology is full of exceptions.
And I wish I could have brought up Haeckel's embryos, but as I said, you only had 2 minutes to talk. I had to present my entire case in less than 2 minutes. I knew that I couldn't go over that. They were very rude with a lot of the speakers, so that you have to keep it within that 2 minutes.
But 2 minutes for you is about 2,000 words, Owen.
Well, I also have to say words that these people must be able to understand, and I can't put subtitles on it. So
yeah.
I was hoping that they would ask me about Haeckel's embryos, because I talked to some of the other scientists, and they didn't bring up Haeckel's embryos in an appropriate way.
I mean, going back to concordance's point. So going back to concordance's point, I mean, in summary, it's their starting point. They have an assumed presumption, and they look for evidence,
yes.
And that is totally incompatible with intellectual integrity and honesty.
Yeah. Now that guy that was arguing that even the photographs were fraudulent, he said that the scientific community knew that these drawings weren't what Haeckel represented them to be. Now the funny thing about that is that the guy who's talking does not know what it was that Haeckel was trying to represent them to be, and it is not the same thing that the microphotographs are trying to represent it to be. Haeckel was trying to argue for the concept that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That was his proposal, and it was overturned by Ernst Baer in a different style of evolutionary embryology. It was an argument within the confines of evolution. It was not a presentation against creationism. It wasn't even an argument for evolution. He was trying to argue for his particular branch of how evolution was revealed in embryology, and he was shown by other scientists to be wrong. When I tried to explain this, even to other scientists in the room, they didn't understand the point that I was getting at, so I guess it doesn't really matter. The argument was all over the place. I don't understand, and I'm sure that creationists don't understand, when they object to Haeckel's embryos, and they object to it because he had supposedly enhanced some image to show or depict what it was that he was trying to show, and he was criticized for it and corrected it. They say, oh, well, he was criticized for it, so it was fraudulent and it was a lie. No, the man was an artist first and a scientist second, so he was open to his own interpretations of things. I can forgive him as an artist. As a scientist, I can't forgive error that way. So that's the way we are. But we don't make out of it what it never was. There's no reason to remove Haeckel's embryos except for the fact that they are 150 years old and a subjective impression that cannot possibly compete with microphotographs. There's no other reason to take them out. We have microphotographs. They don't belong to be there because they're just not as good and never were.
There's one point that, I'm sorry, Almighty, I'll come to you in a second, but there's one point that I think we need to clarify. We haven't actually said what the outcome was. Tell us about the outcome, Oren, and then we'll go to Almighty.
Oh, well, the outcome was good enough, but it was kind of a foregone conclusion. While they advertised days in advance that they were considering these materials from the Discovery Institute and from this other creationist organization in New Mexico, they had pulled those from consideration that morning. Now, they told all the speakers, who had to arrange many of them to drive for many hours to get there, myself included. It was almost 4 hours for me to drive to get there. And all these people had to have 35 copies of their statement already written out, typed out, and made copies so that you can pass them around the room. So that you can't deviate very much from this. This is the presentation that you've come down to present. And then they change it that morning. Within 48 hours of the event, a lot of the things still weren't available online as to what they were actually going to be speaking on or approving. So they challenged people, have you read these things? No, I was given 2 days to find out about this. The registration closed at 5 o'clock Monday. I only found out about it on Facebook on Sunday. How could I possibly have read anything? But I'm going to act on it. Now, a lot of these people were badly reprimanded, and the amusing thing was that the Board of Education said that everybody's been very, very polite so far, so they expected that people giving their testimonies would be equally polite. They were, and they were soundly blasted by the board for daring to bring up their concerns.
Tell us what the outcome was, though, Aaron. You keep
the outcome, of course, was that since they had already removed the creationist materials, then they voted down any inclusion of creationist materials and accepted unanimously the recommendation for science. So there was no hint of creationist nonsense in there, with the singular exception of the potential removal of Haeckel's embryos on false allegations and the changing or the questioning of the comparison between morphological phylogenies morphological and genetic phylogenies and how they supposedly don't agree if you word the statement correctly. So they were still doing their best to question it, but ultimately the vote came down in favor of science. There is one person on the board who I had to identify as an ally of science, in that he at least knew what the definition of a theory was and demonstrated that when I went before them to talk. He also reprimanded one of the creationist organization's people that was out there when he was challenging that we should be skeptical of certain scientific theories, and he challenged him to say what scientific theories he was skeptical of besides evolution. Do you think we should be afraid of dark matter, for example? And well, of course, the guy.
Perhaps we might.
And I was very impressed because this was a guy on the Board of Education. This was Dr. Soto. So we have somebody up there with a PhD. We're not talking about people who homeschool and who also who were homeschooled and never got a degree and also advertise publicly and in publications that the public education system is a tool of the devil. At least those people are not on the board anymore, and we've replaced some of them with actual thinking beings.
Almighty, you've been very quiet.